It has, to understate things, been a tough time of late for fans of storied franchises. Star Wars, Star Trek, The Lord of the Rings all seem to have been taken over by a cabal of their enemies, and the only thing stopping us from saying that these people have deliberately set out to ruin them is that their ruination speaks to a level of competence these people simply do not possess. In response, fans seem to have divided into two camps. The first of these says that the fact their beloved books and shows have been in the by a with a stuck so far up their that they end up sideways means that they will never again watch one of these shows, at least until their current slave masters have been deposed, because to do so is to support their destruction. The second clings to the hope of redemption, achieved by one of several means: luck, market or audience pressure, divine intervention maybe, and whatever else. Most people I know who are in this camp expect to be disappointed, but nevertheless hope that they may not be. And one can, at least in theory, enjoy the current offering without saying anything much at all about the quality of previous iterations. For my part, I am just a humble YouTube critic, and it is not my job to pass judgment on such lofty questions. I simply observe and note my findings. But were I to overstep my marks slightly, I'd say that Strange New Worlds, the latest Star Trek offering from Paramount Plus that began streaming late last week, lends itself, if only slightly, to the latter and more optimistic camp. Which is to say, it's the first time since long before we started this channel that I finished an episode of a Star Trek show with something positive to say about it. Further even than that, in fact, I finished episode 1 with more positive things than negative to say about it. That being said, I reviewed the first episode of Picard Season 2 and said it at least had the look and even some of the feel of a proper Star Trek episode, though before you switch off in disgust, I did correctly predict it would get worse from there, and on that more in a later video. So it's obviously unwise to place too much emphasis on first impressions. But whereas Picard was obviously going to get worse, the most that can be said of Strange New Worlds is that it will only probably get worse. Episode 1 was, in fact, really quite good, if only by comparison. And the show has all the ingredients required to make a fine dish, as long as nobody lets Alex Kurtzman shit in the mixing bowl. The basics of its plot are as follows. Captain Pike is in self-imposed exile on Earth and reluctant to return to space, having had a glimpse of his char-grilled future in Season 2 of Star Trek Discovery. We see him watching a clip from the original The Day the Earth Stood Still, which is a nice touch on its own, but actually, and surprisingly, becomes relevant later. His first officer, meanwhile, is on a first contact mission that goes wrong. She and her crew disappear, and Pike is coaxed back into service by his need to rescue her. There is a difficult balance to be struck with Pike in this show. He was by far the most popular thing about any season of Star Trek Discovery, hence the existence of Strange New Worlds, but he was so because of his charisma, his easy and rustic charm, his evident personality, and the fact Anson Mount can actually act. Obviously then he would stand out in Discovery, which is otherwise stuffed full of bland, superficially emotional non-entities who couldn't act their way into, well, any other show. Strange New Worlds has to deal with the fact Pike knows his fate, but at the same time, it has to avoid having him wallow too deeply in the consequences of that fate, for if he does, it will strip him of everything that made him popular to begin with. And within the first few minutes of episode 1, we see that Strange New Worlds is not going to repeat the bleak mistakes of Star Trek Picard. Pike sucks it up, remembers his duty and his loyalties, puts aside his fears, and takes up the mission. He's assisted by Spock, now shorn of the beard and associated mental illness of Discovery's Season 2. Where Anson Mount is one of this show's strengths, the same cannot quite be said of Ethan Peck. He's not bad to look at, and he manages something of Leonard Nimoy's tone of voice, but Spock is deceptively difficult as a character to play. He mutes his emotions, but he is not bland and expressionless, or at least he isn't supposed to be. Peck did a reasonable job, albeit in a role that did a disservice to the character, with the semi-psychotic iteration of Spock we saw in Discovery. But now he's recovered, the role requires a different style and approach, one with many more restrictions and much more subtlety, and Peck hasn't quite found the right balance yet. They and the rest of the proto-crew of the Enterprise set off to the planet number 1 was due to make contact with, and here they're assigned Strange New Worlds is rectifying another mistake of NuTrek, this time one prevalent in Discovery. It's actually fleshing out a secondary cast of characters. The obvious candidate would be Uhura, given the fan service value, but the show actually, quite astutely, doesn't trade too heavily on her presence. It seems to understand, as the original series, The Next Generation and Voyager all did, that to make a starship a believable place to inhabit requires believable characters to inhabit it. Discovery's born-again obsession with Jesus deprives the rest of its crew of anything by way of personality, but Strange New Worlds is attempting to fit out a full bridge crew with at least the semblance of personality. Granted, it doesn't always do this all that well. Some of them come across more as caricatures, largely because the show is trying to flesh them out too quickly. But we can at least appreciate the effort, even if the delivery could use some fine-tuning. And this will be a theme as we continue in this review. The planet in question has a warp signature, hence the first contact mission, but no evidence of a warp drive. After some debate, again slightly rushed but at least present, they discover that this world has not created a warp drive, it has created a warp bomb. It is, moreover, locked in a kind of Cold War, its factions in a state of militarized hyper-paranoia, and now with the ability to wipe each other out at the press of a button. Again, the delivery here is somewhat lacking. Spock explains the development of the bomb before the drive as being like a nuclear bomb being created before the invention of particle physics. He seems to think this is a possibility that simply never occurred. To the best of my scientific knowledge, it simply isn't a possibility. But though this aspect of the setup is clumsy, the idea behind it, and the world it creates as a result, actually is very encouraging. Here at last is a modern Star Trek show that actually wants to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, and so to explore something about our current one via the abstracted means of science fiction. It also seems to care about its world building for its own sake. Now, I know there are those who will resent any show that acknowledges the existence of Star Trek Discovery, and I can see why. But given these two shows share continuity, it couldn't not mention something about what happened in Season 2, and it actually uses it rather well, using the wreckage resulting from the space battle in Season 2's finale as a quite realistic explanation for the proliferation of warp tech to surrounding worlds. I use the word proliferation deliberately because, again, in the manner of old Trek, the show has a contemporary philosophical and ethical issue to explore, this one being nuclear proliferation. This is a relatively safe choice, being as it is effectively old hat now, and not part of any contemporary political psychodrama. But it's also an eternal issue, eternal at least as long as nuclear weapons exist. Old Trek was good at picking these broad topics and themes to explore. New Trek has until now preferred to pick particular and hyper-politicized contemporary issues to lecture us on. That Strange New Worlds takes the former approach in this episode is, again, encouraging, but a little more on that later. They locate their missing crewmates and prepare to beam down to retrieve them. They decide they need some kind of disguise, and the ship's doctor is introduced with a new form of genome editing device that can temporarily give the crew the characteristics of the natives. A kind of polyjuice potion, if you like. For people who didn't have a childhood, that's the potion in Harry Potter used to disguise the user by having them transmogrify into somebody else. And the resemblance of function is so striking that I'm not sure it's a coincidence. I'm not going to be the best person to judge how well this prequel show fits with the broader continuity of Star Trek. New Trek generally hasn't been very good at that, hence replicators existing in Discovery but not in the original series. But unless there's an episode of old Trek where a similar gene editing device is used, it does pose continuity issues. Because if it is that useful as a disguise, why wouldn't they have used it in the original series or The Next Generation or Voyager whenever they go on an away mission where blending in and remaining undetected is important? They beam down to the planet, and the show runs into some design issues. On the whole, it's a beautiful thing. They've spared no expense on effects. But effects cannot replace imagination, and here the designers have very little of it. That so many of Trek's alien species are humanoid is a well-established trope, a cliché even, but attempts are usually made to mark them out from human civilization by other means, prosthetics, but also dress. For some reason, though, it appears fashion on this new world has evolved along almost precisely the same lines as on Earth. Couldn't they have come up with something, anything, more imaginative for attire than blazers and shirts and ties? These are accompanied by shorts, which is the only mark of difference with human dress, though it is worth mentioning that some fashion houses on Earth have attempted this combination before. That they are designing clothes for aliens is probably the only way their choices make sense. We get a bit more world building here, but it's chiefly by remove. This part of the episode is essentially a heist job, and that's the bit the writers are interested in, which is a shame, because running around and getting into fights is probably the least interesting thing they could be doing, given the genuinely good work that has gone into the world building and the setup thus far. They've created a perfect opportunity to explore an interesting concept, essentially nuclear proliferation in a Cold War setting. That is potentially fascinating. But the mission allows relatively little time to actually interrogate that setup. They have to break into a facility, find the disappeared Federation officers, and get them out. We see glimpses of the world around them, but those glimpses beg questions the show doesn't seem that fussed about answering. Instead, we get a passable heist and action sequence, but you could get that from any number of other shows. To its credit, though, it doesn't completely ignore its premise, and it does actually explore the consequences of space battles among warp-equipped ships near pre-warp planets. And there's actually some competent writing in the payoff from the clip of the day the Earth stood still mentioned earlier, because this forms Pike's motivation and is the basis of his actions once the show has completed its action sequence and the Federation officers have been rescued and Pike gets captured by the natives. To be clear, this act, the show's third, is far from perfect. Because it spent so long on its heist, it has to compress the philosophy. But the fact it's doing philosophy at all is a significant step up from its companion shows in Discovery and Picard. It benefits from being episodic as opposed to serialized, because not all events have to be tailored to the grander narrative, which allows the writers a bit more time and leeway. They haven't struck the right balance in this episode, but they are at least making use of the room they've been afforded. Pike has a debate with the leader of the faction with the warp bomb, which is relatively standard pacifism versus militarism, progress versus regress kind of stuff. Nothing all that complicated. But again, something Star Trek really should be doing, should have done a lot more of already. The militaristic leader explains the virtues of the bigger stick approach, which prompts Pike to call down the Enterprise and prove he has a far, far bigger stick actually. There's also a reference to Arthur Clarke's childhood's end in the appearance of the Enterprise above the planet, which forces a cessation of hostilities. In that book, aliens emerge in gigantic spaceships which hover above all the major cities of Earth and, benignly but effectively, put an end to human conflict. And this reference, like that to the day the Earth stood still, is evidence that this show actually seems to like science fiction and has some respect for its literary traditions, which is a marked departure from the approach taken by both Discovery and Picard, which barely count as sci-fi shows. They certainly aren't interested in the science, and their fiction is lackluster. Those shows are social justice lectures in space. Episode 1 of Strange New World is a very welcome corrective. When the show does bring its philosophical arc to a climax, Pike explaining World War III to the natives, it takes a big risk. This was the perfect opportunity to lapse into the kind of petty politicking and overt political campaigning of its peers. And being hypercritical, it's both sidesism about the cause of World War III, which it attributes simply to competing ideas about liberty, is a bit of a cop-out. But remarkably for a NuTrek show, it doesn't actually politicize this story. It doesn't apportion blame to any specific faction, people, group, whatever. It steers clear of any specifics that would require it to take a contemporary political side. It lectures broadly, not particularly, based primarily on values and not politics. The fact its answer seems to be anti-nuclear and in favour of generalised disarmament can be criticised, or at the very least critiqued. I subscribe to the view that the reason we haven't had nuclear annihilation is precisely because we've not had unilateral disarmament. But this show does actually take a distinctly Trekish approach to the question. Its values here broadly align with the values of older series. I might criticize its answers, but Star Trek has never espoused all my answers, and I'm pretty happy about that. It isn't supposed to. There is a certain naivety in liberal universalism of the type old Trek espoused, which I might not agree with in every one of its forms, its prognostications, or its answers to the big societal and political questions. But that is not and has never been the point of a Star Trek show. No one political faction is supposed to be able to monopolize it. Again, one of the significant, if not the overbearing flaw in the other two modern NuTrek shows. Star Trek is supposed to take this liberal universalist approach. It is supposed to be optimistic, even if that reaches the point of naivety. And Strange New Worlds actually seems as if it's remembered its own reason for being, and that is very much to be welcomed. Rather than make some profoundly dumb point about the state of the modern world, Strange New Worlds concludes with Pike's success in dissuading the natives from using the warp bomb. Yes, it's rushed again, too much time was spent on the heist and not enough on this aspect of the story, but the idea and its conclusion are, I'd argue, definitively old Trek. That again is encouraging. The fact this was a self-contained story playing out in a single episode required that the writers achieve a better balance between action and dialogue than they proved to be capable of in the event, but they got enough right to make it enjoyable and, in places, even thoughtful. That and the knowledge that the story was self-contained and the next episode will be taking us to another different world and another different story, and yet more opportunities for exploration, rather than dragging out a shallow ongoing narrative, has you wondering what might happen next, rather than dreading it. All in all then, Episode 1 of Strange New Worlds is far from perfect in its delivery, but in its approach, and in its motives, in its own sense of itself, it actually does resemble a Star Trek show. It does seem more interested in exploring strange new worlds than in lecturing us about ours. It has a solid cast of characters, and it seems to have ideas about what to do with them. And at long last, we have a Trek show again that is optimistic, and that aspires to be semi-intelligent science fiction rather than a cynical retelling of all our contemporary faults. We've more than enough reason to be cynical ourselves about its future direction. It could all go very badly wrong, and if the past is any guide, it absolutely will. But for now at least, I can close a review for the first time on this channel with something good to say about an episode of Star Trek. And that is an encouraging thought.